course, another side, how much propaganda disinformation can be a threat to different communities, to democracy overall. And I personally work a lot with social media, specifically propaganda and disinformation on social media. We try to use some fancy tools, using some artificial intelligence and other stuff to be able to analyze it more efficiently, because the quantity and diversity of propaganda and disinformation is constantly growing, especially in Ukraine since the start of full-scale invasion. So that is a bit about me and about what we're going to talk today. And I would just start right away with getting to know a little bit about you. So I would really ask you to go to menti.com and use this code. I will also insert the link into a chat for your convenience, and just to anonymously answer, like, where do you get information from? Like, if you want to know what's happening in your country, in the world, where do you go to? If it's a specific media you are usually reading, is it the social media, friends, family? Just write key sources of information that you get, because that's from my field of work, from what I do, that's how I get to know people a little bit better. So that would be a very nice way for me to get to know a little more about you. Okay, we have already some answers. Connection with close friends. Yes, I assume. TV, Instagram. Okay, we have some names of the media. Great. Newspaper, news. Friends, Instagram, Telegram channels, public broadcasting. Oh wow, very nice. The public broadcasting, and yes, so Facebook, social media, and overall LinkedIn. Nice, we have someone being on LinkedIn. I'm really pushing myself to get there, but it's my personal struggle. So, and Twitter. Okay, nice. Thank you so much. So with all of this, with all of the sources of information that we have, it's just we have to be very, very cautious, because propaganda and disinformation can find a way anywhere, you know. So we have, of course, it mostly right now resides in social media, some trashy websites, a lot of that. But we also have seen lots of cases when Russian propaganda and disinformation actually made it to world media. You know, when they made like big stories covering either it's a situation in Ukraine, like Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, or some other events. Unfortunately, there were cases when top media outlets in the world were also spreading pro-Russian propaganda and disinformation. Sometimes you don't really, sometimes sources are very unexpected. It doesn't mean, like, when we say that they spread pro-Russian propaganda disinformation, it doesn't mean that they have signed some contract with Russia, you know, and they are on the payroll. Sometimes it just the rhetoric can coincide, or they can share some things because of the way how they were influenced, because of maybe some politics being involved. That there are lots of motivations that push people to actually spread propaganda and disinformation, especially those who are influential. Like, for instance, we have numerous statements of Pope Francis on Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, saying that war should be stopped at any cost, that there should be negotiations, and Ukraine should give up everything that is needed just to establish peace, which is actually echoing a lot the Russian propaganda that we have been seeing lately on the Russian state-controlled media and other sources. So that is just to say that we have to be cautious everywhere, on every platform. And there is, like, of course, in an independent media, we are much more safeguarded, I would say protected from that, but we have to be to have our critical thinking always on. Because basically, if we look like if we imagine the information environment, this is how the perfect information environment should look like. And there are actually different studies that show that the more safe and structured digital environment we have around us, the better we feel mentally. And this is, of course, the perfect thing that like we have a lot of information, but we know exactly what do we want and where we can find it. But with information overload, mostly it looks like this. It's very like it's a picture, but still you kind of get the logic. And when it comes to propaganda and disinformation, it tries to basically make our environment, information environment looks like this, to basically have so many shades of colors so that it would be very hard to navigate information environment, so that it would be very hard to find the truth and maybe at some point even to give up on actually looking for truth and just deciding that it doesn't matter anymore or so on and so forth. Just try to confuse emotionally people as much as possible. So I would just briefly start with some of the key terms we use when we talk about propaganda disinformation. It's not, academic lecture on what do we call what, but it's rather very important from two perspectives. First, how we label some things. Like when we say that someone spreads propaganda or someone spreads disinformation or some other things, it has like implications. Yeah, what kind of label we put when we say that someone or some organization do that, or it's the other part is about how we actually counter it, because of the way how we identify what is it, what type of malign information activity it is. It highly requires another set of tools. And I'll just briefly explain you on some of the key terms. I think mostly we all heard the term propaganda. And can you write in the chat if you think that propaganda is, from your perspective, do you consider it something positive or negative? If positive, you could just write a plus, if negative, a minus. Just from your personal perspective about propaganda as a term. Okay, plus minus, 50-50, depends. Okay. Okay, neutral. Interesting. Yeah, it's with the word propaganda. Propaganda is definitely the most famous word here, and basically, propaganda is just a set of activities that has a goal to set some specific views and influence behavior to achieve some specific result. Theoretically, propaganda does not have a negative connotation. Like it's not a negative itself, but unfortunately we are used to knowing propaganda only from some toxic contents, some toxic backgrounds. That's why for us, it's, for most people, propaganda is mostly considered like negative. But frankly speaking, why I'm like saying that it is rather neutral, it doesn't have a negative connotation, like propaganda at its core, because most like governments in the world, like they do propaganda, and that's not bad, because the, like, even like the propaganda of healthy lifestyle or something like that. So it's the way we decide either it's a positive or negative propaganda is from the perspective who propagates, what propagates, and for what purpose, what's like the end goal of it. The second thing is disinformation. Disinformation, some consider disinformation under the umbrella of propaganda, like one of the key concept it uses. Disinformation is probably the also very, very famous, especially with the recent years, it became very famous. There are like two very important characteristics of disinformation that define it within other types of information influence, is that disinformation is always about false or manipulative information, or and it has intent to harm. So disinformation cannot be positive or neutral to some extent. And it's also very important to understand that disinformation is about some systematic activity. So that's something that is happening over and over and over again. And again, why it's important? Because there is also a term misinformation, which is called also like false, inaccurate, or manipulative information, but it has no intent to harm, and it has no systematic nature. And I will just give you examples. So, like for instance, you are subscribed to some media, you're reading some specific media, and they shared some piece of manipulated content or even fake. Does this mean that they are spreading disinformation? Not really. If they don't have this false intent, if they correct it straight away, if they acknowledge that they made a mistake, and if they do not have this systematically, then it's just misinformation. And when we see misinformation as a problem, it's mainly about education, educating people that are doing that, educating journalists to equip them with better tools, with understanding of journalistic standards, and so on and so forth. Misinformation is like a very human thing, you know, we all make mistakes, it's okay. But disinformation is about like systemic activity. So, for instance, if we look at Russia Today, and compare it to other media that sometimes maybe made some posted some fakes or some manipulative information, we understand that they have the intent to harm and they have the systemic nature, which means there is no training in the world that would help Russia Today to stop spreading propaganda and disinformation. So we need completely different tools to actually fight with disinformation in that regard. And the last but not least is malinformation. Malinformation is kind of a relatively new concept, I would say. Malinformation is true information. Usually it's some personal data that is intentionally shared to discredit organization or person. So my favorite story basically about malinformation is how my organization, where I'm currently leading research, Detector Media, it's Ukrainian civil society organization, was actually attacked using malinformation. It was that 3 years ago, we were doing an analysis of uh, pro-Russian Telegram channels, and we posted this huge research with all of the names of them, claiming that, okay, this and this, here they share Russian propaganda disinformation, and they really didn't like it. So they've started like coordinated campaign against our organization, and what they did is that they went to our website, and on our website, we publish, as most of civil society organization, like report on the activity and report on the finances, just showing, being as much transparent as possible. So they downloaded the report itself, and they started publishing some of the pictures, like some of the parts of the reports in the anonymous Telegram channels, saying that we have secret documents about like true money that so-called Soros, because you know it was back then, there was this huge conspiracy targeting Ukraine, and not only Ukraine, lots of countries, about civil society organizations being like some piglets of George Soros servants, like this external governance. I'm pretty sure you're all aware about that. So they were like, okay, now we know. We will show you the truth about how much these Soros guys are earning. And it was very funny because they took the picture from the website of the team, and they just took the biggest number they found in the whole financial report and divided it by the amount of people they saw in the picture. And they were like, you see how much money they make per person, which was like completely ridiculous. But this is the great example of malinformation, because the report itself is true. we publish it ourselves on the website to be transparent, but it could be taken out of content, it could context, it could be used to actually harm person or organization. And it's becoming more and more, the more information we have online, you know, the bigger the malinformation as a threat becomes, you know, to be able to use that, unfortunately, against sometimes against people's will, and to attack either the person or organization. So these are like the key things, the key activities and terms we use when we want to talk about propaganda and disinformation in overall, not just Russian one, but overall. And when we look inside of propaganda and disinformation, um, that's how we analyze the content, how to understand the propaganda and disinformation within. And I'm always saying propaganda and disinformation because when we are talking about Russian malign information activity, they are combining propaganda and disinformation, which means that they have some set of narratives that want to pursue person, that they are not completely false, you know, they are just some imperialistic vision of Russia and Russia in the world and the vision of other countries, and at the same time using disinformation, completely disorienting people in information environment. So when we look at it, we have like basically three key building blocks. It's about fakes, messages, and narratives. So the fakes, they are like the lowest of information war. Fakes, manipulations, because they are the cheapest to produce. It's very cheap basically to produce fakes, and most of them, like from our experience of analysis, like about 85% of all fakes are completely like they are very obvious, or they are ridiculous, or they are very poorly made. Like finding like a quality fake which is very hard to debunk and understand like what's happening with it. They are just like within this 15-20 maximum percent. Most of them are just like this, and they are being reused over and over. We have some fakes being identified like again and again each year in different information environments. Then we have messages. So messages, they are like a very clear statement. They could be either true, or they could be manipulative. They could be a bit exaggerated. It depends on the, so messages, they are more targeted per specific audience. And they are like the second layer of this information war. And then at the top, we have basically narratives. And narratives, they are they are big stories that actually explain us how the world works. And the narratives themselves, they are the ones that are impacting our decision making from the perspective of propaganda and disinformation. So there are lots of fakes. There are fewer messages because fakes are fueling messages. And there are even less narratives because narratives, they are huge, they are big, and they are just explaining us really how the world works. And I will give you like this practical example from Ukraine. So the biggest narrative, it still is the biggest narrative of Russian propaganda and disinformation about Ukraine, is that Ukraine is a failed state. And it has different messages. This is not an extensive list. The list is very big. It's just an example. Is that, for instance, Russian propaganda and disinformation claims that Ukrainian army is very weak. It's actually just a bunch of random people, as they claim. They are trying to elaborate this vision that Ukraine is a failed state, claiming that, for instance, Ukrainian language is not actually a language, or it's a dialect of Russia. There are a lot of different kind of historical narratives over here, like historical perspectives, you know, claiming that Ukraine was invented and by Poles, by Austria, and so many countries and people that Ukraine was allegedly invented by as a fictional project, and they are all leading to this narrative that Ukraine is a failed state. Or like one of the messages that, oh, Ukraine, it's even before the full-scale invasion, that, oh, Ukraine is on the verge of economic collapse. This country is right about collapse. So, and how do they formulate it in the minds of people? Is not, and that's when we go like on the lowest level, and that's where fake and manipulation start. Like for instance, in order to formulate this vision about Ukrainian so-called failure army as they wanted to depict it, they shared various fake stories about that Ukrainian armed forces are taking only like homeless people or alcoholics because no one else wants to go to Ukrainian armed forces. Or like, for instance, very recently, our team did analysis of how Russian propaganda and disinformation exploits gender and sexuality. And what they are doing is that they are saying that, oh, Ukrainian army is so weak that they taking even women into army. Because in their vision, like that's the way to discredit the Ukrainian army. You know, they've been exploiting it a lot, or saying that, oh, Ukrainian army even has gays, which means it's a very weak army. So that's how they weaponize basically gender, sexuality, and exploit it for such a huge even propaganda purposes. And if we look into history, that, for instance, claiming that Ukraine is not a state, we see here lots of fake historical documents. I once found on VK the PhD thesis of Russian professor, university professor, who really wrote a thesis completely based on propaganda and disinformation, claiming that Kyiv Rus was on the whole planet of Earth, and Russia being, again, historically not correct, but like Russia being the ancestor, that Kyiv Rus is the ancestor of Russia. It means that like Russia has kind of a historical justification to basically own the whole world, which sounds very ridiculous, but they do have like a PhD thesis written about that, and that professor was going to academic conferences even abroad, and we're pushing all that kind of propaganda using these falsified documents and stuff. So sometimes even though it may seem from the very first view that it is ridiculous, unfortunately, it doesn't mean that it's not effective, and it's finding its audience and just, again, repeating itself over 100 times, like, over and over. Or just the third thing about Ukraine, about Ukrainian economy about to collapse. Here we have different like manipulations with unemployment rate, and so on and so forth. But the most interesting for me, for instance, it's in 2017, we first identify like fake. And at first, I didn't understood that this was the Russian fake. It was fake, basically saying that tomorrow Privatbank, which is like one of the biggest Ukrainian banks, is not gonna work. All the ATMs are not gonna work. So go and cash out your money right now, save your money, and that was complete fake. It was not true. But since then, they were sending these fakes to Ukraine information environment over and over, again and again, again and again. And we traced it that it's a Russian fake. And then we realized that this fake, together with actually stressing out people and just making them feel insecure, you know, about their future, about everything. Just imagine like people running to ATMs to cash out their money because they have no idea what's going to happen with their bank. And while they are doing that, they have this message in their head. Yeah, of course our bank would not work because probably like our bank is failing. Oh, and why it's failing? Because economy is failing. And why economy is failing? Because politicians corrupt, country is falling apart, and country is a failed state. I'm very simplifying the logic, but in fact, that's how it works. Not that fast, but that's how propaganda and disinformation formulates these kind of things in heads of people all over the world, basically, depending on the target audience. So basically, these narratives, they are explaining to us the world. They are impacting the decision making. Because if the person believes, for instance, Ukrainian person believes that Ukraine is a failed state, it will like at the time, for instance, with the start of full-scale invasion, this person would say, okay, I don't care, I'm not gonna protect my country, I'm not gonna contribute anyhow to save it, I'm just gonna either I don't care whether it's gonna be Russia or Ukraine, or I will just move out and will not care about that at all. If we think, imagine that, for instance, like European people would believe that Ukraine is a failed state, which means they will affect that the public opinion would affect the decision makers in these countries, and these countries would say, why should we send any help to Ukraine? Why should we send any weapons to Ukraine? It is a failed state. Like we don't really care about its existence. Maybe it could go to Russia. You know, that's what propaganda and disinformation is pushing to, and that's how they formulate this logic. And it's very important here to understand that the end goal of all kinds of propaganda and disinformation is impact of behavior. It's not about just, you know, making people believe something and just, them being happy that they believe in something. It's about like directing people towards some actions, taking some actions or not taking some actions. Like, for instance, it's, just to sign a petition or not, to go to a protest or not to go to a protest. Like, for instance, with Russian society, we see that Russian propaganda and disinformation for years, its main goal was to make people do nothing. So their behavior was like directed towards doing nothing. And that's the result that we see basically nowadays. So there are like many, this would be like, you know, very small goals, like to share some information on Facebook or not to share some information on Facebook. That's where like propaganda disinformation could push in a very short-term perspective. And in a long-term perspective, it really impacts the way people want to decide in what societies they want to live. Do they want to live in democratic societies or not? Do they believe in human rights or not? And this is how propaganda and disinformation actually works and affecting all that. So when we talk about the key narratives and messages of propaganda and disinformation, I will zoom in. Don't worry, that's a huge visualization, but I will zoom in on some interesting points. So I will just give you an examples of first, what are these narratives and messages, propaganda and disinformation, using on the example of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in different countries, and how Russian propaganda and disinformation feels the internal agenda of the country and how they target with specific narratives and messages specific countries. So this is the analysis we did in different 11 European countries, and we have the Baltic countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania in their national languages, and also here you have the gray one. It's about Baltic countries, but propaganda disinformation in Russian language that targets these countries. So we see, of course, that Ukraine is kind of one of the biggest targets in terms of quantity for propaganda disinformation, which is, again, unfortunately obvious and expected for us. But if we see let's look, for instance, in Hungary. And we know that in Hungary, unfortunately, current political leadership is quite anti-EU, anti-NATO, quite pro-Russian. So when we see the main narratives and messages, they're saying that sanctions hurt West more than Russia, advocating to eliminate the sanctions, saying that EU and West, NATO are weak and will break apart. And that Western Ukrainian leadership is incompetent, for instance, that the West will no longer provide Ukraine with military aid. West forced Russia to attack Ukraine. West is using Ukraine to. And you see a lot of these things. Like if we go, for instance, in other countries, let's go to Lithuania, for example, in Lithuanian language. We don't see here this huge anti-NATO. We don't see this anti-NATO, anti-EU things almost at the top. But the top narrative is that Lithuania is escalating the war. And why they are pushing it to Lithuanian-speaking population to Lithuania? Because Lithuania is among the countries that contributed the most in terms of humanitarian aid and in terms of weapons and other stuff, the country that accepted so many Ukrainian refugees. So they try to push this idea is that by donating even to Ukraine, you are prolonging the war. Or that you see that certain powers benefit from the war, again, to kind of motivate people to not actually contribute to and to not support Ukraine. And if we look, for instance, in Poland, the key narrative, and you could see its huge size, because the proportion is basically represents the size and information environment, is that Poland should not help Ukraine due to the historical conflict. And Russian propaganda and disinformation for years have been exploiting some of the troubling stories and events of the Polish-Ukrainian history, and they are still using it, weaponizing, even in this context, to through this prism, like to explain to Polish people that no, you should not help Ukrainians. Or that you see that the second top thing is, again, Ukrainian refugees undermine host countries' internal stability, because as we know, Poland has generously accepted one of the biggest community of Ukrainians fleeing the war. So you see how it's nicely targeting, knowing exactly the context of the country. And if we look, for instance, we had Georgia here. Where is that? Oh, here, the green one. And in Georgia, knowing that Russia has already invaded Georgia in 2008, the key narrative is that there will be a second front against Russia in Georgia. And that's what they are trying to push there. So at the end of the day, I will share with you the presentation so you could look into each country in details and just to see it. But the whole idea is that the list of narratives and messages is kind of the same for all countries. But the proportion of each narrative and message in each information environment is completely different, taking into account the country's agenda, the country's political leadership, what people care about, what they do. So unfortunately, but Russian propaganda disinformation is very effective in terms of knowing who to target with what actually, will find some supporters and where. So I would just this is that pyramid with fakes, messages, and narratives, and it's very important to kind of train yourself as one of the first shields against Russian propaganda and disinformation. When you get some kind of information, when you read some piece of content, some news, for instance, try to ask yourself as many questions as possible. Starting with, after reading something, how do I feel about it? Is it impacting the way I'm thinking about something? Do I have some very strong feelings, either positive or negative? For propaganda, it doesn't matter actually, is it positive or negative feeling? It just has to be strong. And the stronger the feeling, the easier it is to be manipulated, to use for doing some action, or for taking or not taking some specific action. So just ask yourself as many questions as you can, and then start like using this pyramid and going to the top. Because the trick with propaganda and disinformation is that it's not always false. It's not always just fakes. It is sometimes propaganda and disinformation takes some of the issues that are actually true to some communities and societies, but unfortunately it weaponizes it a lot. Like for instance, Russian propaganda and disinformation highly weaponized refugees of like in different countries, you know. It exploits, for instance, as I mentioned, gender and sexuality. And it's like, it doesn't mean that unfortunately, you know, but there is no level of homophobia in the countries that are being targeted with that. There is. But what is Russian propaganda doing is that it's trying to weaponize it and to make it look like 100% of people think like that. Or that this is something that people should fight about, to pit one community against other community. So it's not always like that, that is like completely made up stuff or made up things. This is just the things like, what is the goal for that? What's the purpose? So this kind of first shield to propaganda and disinformation is just try to understand to what narrative it contributes. Like, where is this leading me to? Like, and who can benefit from it? Whether it's Russian propaganda or not only Russian, you know, we have unfortunately a lot of authoritarian regimes in this world that are promoting different kinds of propaganda and disinformation. So it's very like important to go through this pyramid and to understand, like, is it the part of this propaganda machine or not? There is one exception when like it cannot be a part. Like for instance, you've read some piece of information, it looks quite suspicious for you, but you've tried to understand what kind of message it's fueling and what kind of narrative it's fueling, and you don't have actually an answer for that. So of course it could mean that, okay, it's probably not propaganda and disinformation, but also in rare cases it could mean that propaganda and disinformation is formulating some new narrative. And that's, of course, when you identify something like that, that's very helpful, because acting proactively before they did it, you know, informing people beforehand, you know, filling the information vacuums is a very, very strong tool. It's much more effective tool than after that just debunking the fake, explaining why it's fake, you know. It's and I will just briefly talk about it in a few seconds. So, but use these pyramids when you have some kind of suspicious content, and just try to understand, is it a part of propaganda and disinformation or not? Because unfortunately, as a it's sometimes not that obvious. Because we see a lot of, especially with Russian propaganda, we see a lot of ridiculous stuff. These fighting mosquitoes that are allegedly trying to be used by Ukrainian armed forces to fight Russia, or something like that. It's from first glance we understand this kind of a nonsense, but at the same time, like, there are a lot of things that are very, very much not obvious. And that's why we need to always look at the broader perspective to understand, okay, where is this getting me to? Me as a citizen of my country, as a part of my community where I belong, like, what does it want from me? And that's the question I think we always have to ask ourselves when we're consuming different types of content and information overall. And just to like quickly say that we have this is the first shield of our resilience to propaganda and disinformation, like understanding it, knowing what it is, understanding what it wants from us, and that helps us a lot into not going there, like not following what propagandists want us to. But there is unfortunately one thing that is called our brain. And in terms of propaganda and disinformation, it often works against us. Do you know about cognitive biases? If yes, write a plus in a chat, please. If no, a minus. Yeah. Yeah, nice. Some are aware of it. So, just to put it simply, the cognitive biases are the mechanism that our brain developed in the process of years of evolution, just to make our life easier, to process information quickly and more effectively. And it sounds good in a theory, but unfortunately, when it was developing this kind of procedures, let's call it that way, some of them simplified reality too much. And from the perspective of propaganda and disinformation, there are a lot of cognitive biases that are impacting the way we consume information and making us more vulnerable to propaganda and disinformation. Like, for instance, there is the cognitive bias about our brain being more open towards picking up arguments that already support something we believe in rather than something new to us. So if we have like the position, these kind of games when we have debates and you need to be the team for or against something. Yeah. So if we truly believe that we're for it, it would be very hard for us, for our brain to actually understand and analyze those arguments that will be against, because we will be already programmed to pick only information that will support our claim. Or the one of my favorite cognitive biases is about like self-fulfilling prophecies and stuff like that. So I mean, I think everyone at least once in our lives we've read a horoscope and we were like, yes, that's about me, exactly, that's totally me. But that's, again, our brain is playing games with us because it picks up the things that it and then make us relate to it. So it basically picks up some facts in our heads to make us like really relate to the text and to think about that. And there are like a lot of these cognitive biases. We will definitely not go through all of them because there are plenty of them. But just what is important with cognitive biases and propaganda and disinformation, it's very important to just educate yourself. Because with cognitive biases, if you know, for instance, how the specific cognitive bias work, every time your brain would want to use it, it will also have an information about this bias. And it will alarm you, like you will have, oh, but am I not doing this? Am I falling into this? Isn't that cognitive bias I learned about? And that's how you actually stop it from happening. So that the way that is like the most effective way to do it, because it's not like we can reprogram our brain. It has been created like in this way through years of evolution, and it will continue to be developing in that direction, because the amount of information we have produced by humanity in 1 second is no longer being able to by our brain to be consumed. So of course we will have to find more and more ways to process information quicker. So that's why we have to be very aware of that. And just the final thing to summarize overall from propaganda and disinformation here, before going into questions and answer, and I would really much appreciate your questions and answer, because the topic is huge, it's very, very broad. So the more questions you have, the more we could get deep into some specific details of it. And just to say that it is interesting and fascinating from the perspective of how we can build our resilience to propaganda disinformation, understanding our cognitive biases and this thing. And one of the strongest shields to protect ourselves is to actually have credo for future. Most of propaganda and disinformation of totalitarian regimes, especially Russian ones, they don't have future. If you really look into it, they are mainly based on the past, and they live in the past. and they are completely terrified of future. So they are very much terrified when people have this dread for future. They have this understanding what they want from their life, what they want to do, what they want to do with their communities overall. So it's not a very obvious thing, you know, to use to protect yourself from malign information influences, but it is. And just to say that from the Ukrainian perspective, Ukraine has shown, Ukrainian community, like Ukrainian people, has shown this great level of resilience to propaganda and disinformation. I mean, we've been analyzing it for years, and right before Russia's full-scale invasion, we had several data points showing that over 70% of Ukrainians, they are choosing truthful narratives, not the propaganda narratives. That this threat awareness is very high in society, that people understand that propaganda and disinformation can literally kill. So we were prepared to the fact that, okay, Ukrainian society will resist to Russian malign information campaign. But even I am working in this field, I'm so surprised to what extent people are actually resisting to it. And definitely the key building blocks are awareness, threat awareness, understanding how it works, understanding the consequences, and having this hope, you know, this hope for better future and this understanding of better future. So I will summarize on this, and I will be very happy to answer your question. Thank you so much.
Yes, Ksenia, thank you very much for the amazing presentation. And yeah, please write in your questions in the chat or raise your hand. But we already had one question in the chat from Sally. He is asking, can we include using a natural language into malinformation or any other category?
Can you elaborate a bit what natural language means? Some examples.
Sally, can you tell more?
Can I speak?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure about in the this war context, but for example, for police violence in my country or most of the countries, they say, I don't know, clashes with police, even though they are illegally attacking people and destroying a peaceful protest, they are saying clashes or like police officer involved shooting or something, but they are literally attacking and killing people. Like you cannot use kind of language, but Reuters or Associated Press, I think they say we are using natural language. I think you understand it. Right.
Yeah, that's definitely a part of propaganda and disinformation. Usually propaganda, because that's a very typical technique of propaganda to use, because that's manipulation, you know, that's not using the correct words. It's from these parallels, it's the same that we have, for instance, right now, that Russia calling it special military operation, not calling it actually a war, or that a lot of Western media are still using the word conflict, which is again not a proper word to use. And this is also a part of Russian propaganda disinformation, because it wants to use different words, not the words that are actually describing what's happening, to kind of formulate this different different vision, as you've said, this just a clash, not real violence, just to kind of change this emotional perspective. So this is definitely a technique that is being highly used by propaganda and disinformation in so many contexts. So everything that is connected to language is of extreme importance. It seems like it's not, sometimes we say it's just a word, but in fact, it really means a lot. And it could sometimes, on one word, propaganda can build the whole ecosystem of narratives. So it is definitely a part of propaganda and disinformation.
Thank you for a question and answer. I will give word to Sinta and Marta, and then I will read questions. Yes, Sinta?
Thank you very much. I would like to know also if there is a pattern regarding age. Like, for example, I really think, like, sometimes I'm finding myself thinking, of course, these propaganda or these fake news are getting into my, I don't know, my elder relatives, because they even believe that WhatsApp is going to be, you know, you will have to pay for WhatsApp and all this obvious fake news. And I'm like, of course they believe everything, because they would believe anything. Is this something that has to do with age? Maybe the cognitive bias is also affected by technology. I mean, to what extent age and skills have an impact on how we believe propaganda, or we don't regard propaganda from a critic point of view?
Thank you so much. I think that's definitely a very interesting question. There are a lot of studies that are trying to identify what makes us more or less vulnerable to propaganda and disinformation. In terms of age, it is the interesting thing that it's not specifically about the number, but it's rather about the type of upbringing in terms of media consumption was. And right now, elderly people are more tend to fall for propaganda and disinformation because, of course, the technological aspect, as you mentioned, because of this lack of knowledge and understanding how the technology works. So there is a huge room for manipulation with that. But it's also about the way when they formulated their media consumption habits years and years ago. It was that the media consumption was completely different. There were just a limited amount of sources to get information. You had these sources, like there was no alternatives. There was just several, you know, the TV, it's a state TV, no questions asked, no critical thinking to that, you know, there was no. And depending, of course, in the regime where people lived, if it was some kind of authoritarian, totalitarian regime, that's definitely impact. Even if people are left that regime for years, it still impacts a lot of how they really understand, like, this. Do they have the perception that this is something that could be questioned? Or do they have the understanding that they should have several sources altogether? But it's very hard for them because they spend most of their life, for instance, in the society where there was only TV, for instance. So there was just no other source, technically. So I think that in terms of age, that's the biggest thing, because these kind of like behavior patterns, they impact, of course, this susceptibility to propaganda and disinformation.
Thank you. Marta?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask you how to deal with maybe clashing propaganda narratives or clashing propaganda from several states and actors, and how to respond to that in conversation. So, for example, many of my friends or people I know, especially left people I know, always spread like things about the Euromaidan in Ukraine and try to justify the war in Ukraine with saying that the Euromaidan was so influenced by the West and so on. And I know that most of the things that are said are probably not entirely true and also part of Russian propaganda. But at the same time, there's also strong propaganda from the West. And I'm always not sure how to navigate in that situation. Maybe you can talk about, clashing propagandas when there's not to be identified one side that is clearly, spreading misinformation and one side that is spreading true information.
Thank you so much. I would say that sometimes propaganda of one regime collapse even within, like, clashes even within, like, that's a very typical thing, for instance, for Russian propaganda and disinformation, to spread at the same time messages that are saying completely the opposite, because in that way they are developing this cognitive dissonance, you know, and just having people in this mentally, emotionally in a very challenging environment, because it's easier to manipulate people like that. So sometimes it's a very conscious choice to do that, and a very conscious tactic to do that. When it comes to like, as you say, several propagandas and stuff, so the thing is that, of course, as I've mentioned, that propaganda is the part of state activities, and it's kind of normal. Like to what extent it could be normal, but I mean, it is within the way how they work. It's just about what they propagate and to who and with what goals. But I would say that actually a huge part of Russian propaganda and disinformation wants us to think that there is this lots of propaganda coming from, as you said, the West and stuff, and they want us to believe that there is no truth. But in fact, there is truth, and it's very objective, and you could really feel it and understand what it is. It just, unfortunately, as I showed you in this picture in the beginning, very just a picture, but it still shows that it just requires more efforts from us to find it and to navigate through it. But definitely there is truth and there are facts, and it's not a question to debate, you know. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that we also have to understand is that when propaganda comes from even the countries that have democratic values at the core, it's a completely different propaganda that comes from countries that have authoritarian rule of law, authoritarian rule. Because just for you to understand, for instance, we just finished the focus groups with several Ukrainian, like communities of Ukrainians in different abroad and inside of Ukraine, asking about propaganda and disinformation. And we also asked, like, what do you think about Ukrainian propaganda? And they were like, yeah, we see it. And all the respondents were like, we are fine with it. Meaning that they understand that especially in times of war, it is essential to keep up the moral of the people and the moral of the army. And they're like, yes, we are aware of that, we understand that, but for us, it is important that this propaganda is used for these purposes only, and does not exploit disinformation or other manipulative techniques or fakes or something like that. It just amplifying the truthful things, the positive stories and things like that. So I think that's also a huge difference between who is doing that and for what purpose and what cause. And just I know it's hard, especially because all of us have our jobs, families, cats, I don't know, like so many activities. So it's always very hard to dig in and find this truth on so many different subjects. But I highly just say that there is truth, and it's just about finding it and talking about it without disinterpretations from different interpretations.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And now I'm going to read the questions from the chat. So the first question is from Masha. Thanks a lot for the presentation and insights. It is interesting how Russian propaganda machine is blaming everything that Russia itself is sick with in Ukraine. Like the army is not organized, economy is collapsing, etc. Is this also a strategy, or do you think it is done unintentionally, as many other things in this failed state called Russian Federation?
In propaganda and disinformation, there is such a technique. It's called a mirror technique. So you just basically blame others in what you do, or the way how you feel or how you behave. So in this regard, they are really using these techniques, and to some extent they are aware of it pretty good. Like for instance, with a good example on that is about historical propaganda. Russia claims that everyone in the world is rewriting history, and Russia is there to save the history, to safeguard the history. But in fact, Russia is the one who is rewriting it. So they're just using this mirror technique to do that. So I think in this regard, that's a very conscious choice of them also to use this technique to do. And it's easier, you know, to propagate something you already know, you know, from your personal experience.
Thank you. The next question is from Katya. What's the role of Russian liberal oppositional media in spreading pro-Russian narratives?
Unfortunately, so when it comes to Russian liberal media, they claim that they are opposition. They claim that they are opposition to Putin, the Putin regimes, and so on and so forth, and they are against war. But in fact, when we analyze their content, we understand that definitely they are much better in terms of quality of content than Russia Today or Первый канал. They do not write, for instance, about fighting mosquitoes or things like that. But unfortunately, it doesn't mean that they are not spreading other narratives of propaganda and disinformation that are just more sophisticated one. And the biggest problem with the so-called Russian liberal media is that they write from the very imperialistic perspective. And that is also a part of propaganda and disinformation of what Russia wants. And it's very important to understand that even if like their official position, like, oh, we are against war, it doesn't mean that they are ready to give up their imperialistic ambition about Ukraine or any other countries. They still see Russia as this great superpower that has the right to meddle into any other country's affairs, you know, to decide what to do in Estonia or any other country, you know. So that's a huge problem with that. And we just have the very, very great example, very fresh example with the Russian liberal channel Dozhd, which has been 2 days as banned in Latvia and then Lithuania and today in Estonia. Because of that, basically, they made this decision based on several cases when they were spreading this pro-Russian propaganda and this imperialistic way of thinking. And they had, again, unfortunately, they have, when you analyze, like when you look just in general, they seem okay-ish, but when you look into details and you see that for them publishing the map of Ukraine without Crimea is okay, or calling like Russian army our army, but at the same time saying, oh, we are against war, that's not how it's done. Plus there are a lot of questions to journalistic standards and quality of journalists. So in my personal opinion, from our analysis, they are a part of less toxic, definitely, but a part of Russian propaganda machine as well.
Yes, thank you. We have time for these two last questions. And Jan is asking, in Russia pre-war, for many years on TV shows were broadcasted portraying mainly supernatural and pseudo-science topics. For example, cats can teleport. Could it be possible that this was done knowingly to lower critical thinking of people in order to effectively spread misinformation propaganda now?
That's a very interesting question, I would say. It's you know, it's kind of for Russian information environment, it's kind of a chicken egg problem, because from one side there was definitely this kind of attempt to make people more stupid, like literally speaking, they wanted that to do, because it's way easier to just to rule people in like that. But from other side, you know, a lot of content was produced by demand. So there was demand for such kind of content, and for different kind of content, and that's also not just from the perspective of this just supernatural pseudoscience topics, but overall, you know, there was even demand, and there is still demand for Russian propaganda and disinformation from Russian people. So it is kind of this chicken egg problem, because I think there was definitely some intention to do that, to lower the level of critical thinking, but at the same time there was a request for that.
Yes, thank you. And the last question comes from Honor, and he asks, we saw earlier in the presentation that Russia uses different words, ways when spreading propaganda in different countries. Which ways would you think would be most effective to counter these propagandas? And which kind of people from different backgrounds do you think are more likely to be saved from disinformation?
Thank you so much. So in terms of the first question, I would say that the most effective way is to fill the information vacuums and to fill the information gaps. Because Russian propaganda and disinformation, like as soon as there is some space for it, it will fill it very quickly. And when it's done, it's very hard after that to fight with it, you know, to do something about it. And it's always like running behind. So like the train is already going and you are barefoot trying to catch the train. So that's how it's like. So definitely the most effective thing is to professionally, it's called pre-banking. So it's about like two things. It's either we know potentially where propaganda and disinformation will hit, and we provide people with information about the fact that it can happen and how it can happen and what tactics will be used for that. And the second is that we do this explanatory work on the topic itself, and we fill this information gaps, because you know, it's like sometimes we are so scary of propaganda and disinformation, and it is definitely a huge threat. But I've been analyzing it for years, and I would say that it's pretty obvious. I mean, you could like from all of the looking back and having all the data, we can really understand where it will be going, where it's going to develop, what new potential narratives could emerge. Especially when you know your communities and your society very good, you know the strengths and weaknesses. So you could kind of understand what would be the goals of propaganda. So it's very important just to understand that and to try to forecast it. And when you see those gaps, just to fill them with a truthful, productive information. And that's kind of the best shield. The very good example of that, there was like, in Ukraine, there was information from security services of Ukraine that Russia is preparing a deep fake of Zelensky, saying that Ukraine is giving up, that we've decided to not fight anymore. And the security services, they made this announcement that, okay, we have the information that Russia is preparing a deepfake. And different media, civil society organization, we all understood that this is a huge threat. Like, honestly, I can imagine like my grandma watching on TV Zelensky that looks like Zelensky, speaks like Zelensky, saying that, okay, we are not going to fight anymore. We're just going to give up. To explain her afterwards that what they see with their own eyes is not true would be barely impossible. So there was like this very proactive communication, like, okay, this is what's happening. This is deepfake. This is how deepfake works. These are examples of it. Just giving as many, like educating people as much as possible. So when the so promised deepfake came out, it was of very bad quality in reality, but still, when it was in information environment, everyone just laughed at it because everyone was prepared, and it just disappeared from Ukrainian information environment like within 2 days. So this is like a very good strategy, a very powerful strategy. And about the second question, which kind of people from different backgrounds do you think are more likely to be saved from disinformation? So definitely the level of education, but it's not the technical level of the education. That's a very important thing, because we have studies that are showing that people having PhDs have the same chances to share propaganda and disinformation as the ones that just finished a bachelor's degree, for instance. So it's not about technical education, it's rather about education on the subject, education overall. Definitely media literacy skills, like understanding how to analyze information, how to consume it, how to read it properly. So this kind of literacy is very important. And as I've mentioned, of course, people that are in good shape mentally, they are much more resilient to propaganda and disinformation when they know what they want to do, when they are determined, when they first at peace with themselves, you know. So it's, of course, they are a much more complex target for propaganda and disinformation to hit. But definitely case by case, it's about a lot of about different societies. If you're interested in that, I would just recommend to dig into social identities. And that's a very interesting theory about how that each person has several social identities. Like, for instance, I'm a female, I'm Ukrainian, I'm a part of analyst community, and so on and so forth. So we have plenty of them. And by communicating to some specific identity, targeting this identity, propaganda could be much more effective. But on the other side, you could be much more protected from propaganda using the same techniques and principles. So if you're just interested in that, I would highly recommend to look into that direction.
Yes, thank you very much, Ksenia, for very insightful answers and amazing presentation. And yeah, before we go, I want to remind that this webinar series is part of CDN's annual work plan. We are the future, but we are here now. That is supported by European Youth Foundation and Council of Europe. And we totally will share resources and infographics to your emails very soon. And thanks everyone for coming. And maybe, is there any last tips from you, Ksenia, for us?
The last tip would be just to stay positive and to always look at the bright side, as I said, at the future, because that's a very, very good shield from propaganda disinformation, especially from Russian one. And as a Ukrainian, I would just say that stand with